So good morning, everyone, and welcome to St. John's Adult Forum. This is the fourth in our series looking into issues of the Holy Land, and it's really a special forum, so thank you for being here. Today, we have the great privilege of entering into a dialogue that's been going on, as Sari said in the service, for a couple of years between him and our special guest, Rabbi Greg Harris from Congregation Bethel, right here in Bethesda. And Sari and Greg have known each other and have been meeting and discussing for a number of years on their perspectives on issues in the Holy Land, exploring similarities and differences in their views, and especially what faith communities can do to help in this situation. And Rabbi Harris has been the chief rabbi at Bethel for since 2014 when he was elected there. It's a big congregation with about 1,200 families. They do a lot of interfaith work there. They have a special partnership with the United Methodist Church and the Presbyterian Church right in their neighborhood. With them, they're sponsoring a family from the Congo of 9 people, and they're congregants, yes, that's right.
I know you're like, that's nothing, huh?
But I can tell you, they've been of great assistance to us as their family arrived just a month or two before ours did, but that gave them some experience and they've shared it. We appreciate that. We've worked on gun violence prevention. We held a candidates forum together with Bethel. So we have a growing relationship, and we're so happy to be able to welcome Greg Harris here today. Let me remind you that this series took place in the context of our civil discourse curriculum that we did in this forum. And it's an attempt by us to be able to look at difficult issues as a church from the point of view of having civil dialogue, active listening. So we look forward to hearing Greg and Sari, and then when they're ready, they will let us know about questions.
Great.
Right?
Sounds
Okay.
good.
Thank you.
And let me just say, Justin, there's a buzz going on. We can't figure out which microphone it is. So if you can just mess with all 3 of these and see which one it is. I'm talking to the secret person in the closet that none of you can see. So hopefully we'll get that taken care of. So this is really exciting to have Greg here. Greg and I have kind of dreamed about doing this at some point. We've been meeting together for 2 years now, and I'll just tell you really briefly about that. But just to kind of go back a little further, so when I first became the rector, was called to be the rector at St. John's, I remember thinking to myself, for a Palestinian coming to this area, that it is a very predominantly Jewish area. Not predominantly, but there are many Jews in this area. I remember thinking to myself, this is such an interesting chemistry thing. I wonder, God, what you're going to do with this. And it was like 7 years into me being here that I connected with Greg. And I feel for me, this relationship has very much answered that question. And so Greg and I were introduced a couple of years ago, and we had coffee a couple of times, and then we decided, and jump in at any point if I'm forgetting something here, but we decided that we were going to launch into just a very candid, authentic relationship around talking about Israel-Palestine. And so we started getting together. We decided that we wouldn't start right with today. We started with our own connections to Israel-Palestine. I told my story one time we got together, and then he shared his story. And then we started kind of going through our own understandings of maybe the beginnings of why Israel-Palestine is meaningful to both of our faiths and to our people groups. And then where we stopped is with the beginning of the 1948 conflict, the establishment of the State of Israel. And the reason we haven't gone further beyond that is because we hit a few points where historically we couldn't necessarily get our stories to mesh in terms of just what we believed the facts were. And so we decided that we would just pause and see if we could bring in some experts into the conversation. And so we're still in that place where we had a couple of attempts to sit down with someone, and they just kind of fell through for scheduling reasons. But that's where we are. So we haven't actually waded into the actual since 1948 and beyond. We've hinted at it. We've both experienced some of the pressures of that conversation. But I did want to just say, before I turn it over to Greg, because you guys have heard much of my story, and I thought it would be a great way today is to just invite Greg to share a little bit about his own connection, personal connection to Israel. He is not an Israeli Jew. He is a Jew, an American Jew, But how, for us to understand the connection to Israel by American Jews, how does, for him and his own narrative. So I'd love to, is that okay to start with that today?
Yeah.
But the thing I want to share is, being in this conversation, and you'll hear a little bit more about this, I'm sure, as we go along, it hasn't necessarily been the most comfortable thing in the world. We've hit points where I think that we've both felt we've had to step back from the need for validation. Because if you enter into a conversation with someone, you're just looking to validate your own perspective. It becomes hard to find that. So for me, I've had to remind myself on a few occasions, this is not about validation. For me, this is about transformation. It's about transforming myself, transforming the dialogue, and the discourse around this subject. So I've looked very much to learn from Greg and what he has to teach me. I haven't always seen eye to eye, but I think that's exactly why we have been in this conversation. And so with that, I'll just turn it over to you, Greg. And we'll model some of the conversational pieces today when we get to the question and answer time. We might not directly respond to you. We might just talk amongst one another and explore the subject to kind of show you how we've been doing it. So,
Great, thank you. That first of all, you have a tremendous leader in Sari. Being able to take this on, to offer your guidance, not just through our private conversations, but bringing it out to the community is so important and inspirational in so many ways. And so our friendship, like you said, that started 2 years ago or so, and then kind of carefully moved into this area, has been based on exactly what you said. It's been based on listening to each other and calling each other out in loving ways. When you say something, I'm like, whoa, really? You believe that? Or when you say it like that, this is what it sounds like to me. And equally, when I say something that is said as a fact, you're like, whoa, that's not my story at all. And so as we have moved through this, it's been fascinating to see our narratives, our facts, or whatever the phrases are, how they're just different. And that's where we are right now. So, so Greg Harris, I've been in the Washington area my entire adult life. My undergraduate work is at American University. My rabbinical training, 6 years up in New York at the Jewish Theological Seminary, which is up by Columbia. But I'm originally from San Francisco. So baseball season is upon us, so it gets me, it's not just nice for the springtime, but for the baseball season as well. Being connected to Israel is really an amazing experience, because seeing it through so many different people's eyes is really the magic of what the Holy Land is. That I've been there, I don't know, 13, 14 times. My first time I was 16 years old. And I remember sitting on a hillside in Jerusalem, but outside of the old city. And I was on a teen tour. It was a 6-week tour of the country from the north to the south and everything in between. And sitting on that hilltop, looking out at the old city in the background, and kind of a wadi or a valley in between. I've told you the story, and I noticed a bird was flying there, but it wasn't flying. It's not unusual to see birds, but the bird was kind of floating there, just kind of sitting on the winds that were coming through this little valley area, and it was just enjoying the updraft of it. And I thought to myself as a 16-year-old, I'm not the first boy to sit on this hilltop. And that is not the first bird to be enjoying the updrafts with the city of Jerusalem behind it. And that was really the first time for me to recognize that I am part of something so much larger. That I am part of a generational experience, and I use experience in the broadest sense, of different boys, Arab boys, Ottoman boys, British boys, Philistinians from ancient times sitting on hilltops like this, watching the ancestors of that bird. And I think that that type of humility has stayed with me throughout. I've seen that I am in a moment, but I am also part of something far, far larger. And that includes this conversation that we're having.
Let me ask you, I got a question for you, Greg.
Yeah.
One thing, it's not more a question, it's one of the things that I found really powerful when we started talking, and one of the very first words that came up was the word Zionism. And as a Palestinian growing up with the conflict, I've only ever understood Zionism in one context, and that was it was the movement that displaced the Palestinian people. But one thing I found very eye-opening was your understanding of Zionism. And so I thought that that would be a great place for you maybe to also share with us.
Sure, absolutely.
I know we spent a couple of meetings talking about that.
Well,
but in 2 minutes.
Right, exactly. No problem. And and we saw even, I think it was last week or the week before, and I've tried to attend all of these. I watched Ambassador Wilcox's presentation. I watched the tape of it. Is there still tape these days? I don't know. I watched the YouTube of his presentation, but wasn't able to watch the whole part. And Zionism comes up in there as well. And it's important because I think Zionism, and he fell into this as well, is really mischaracterized in so many ways. When you asked your question and we had that conversation. So Zionism is not the will of the Jewish people to displace everyone and to take over the entire land of Palestine. Remember, the entire land of Palestine includes Jordan, it's a vast area. Also remember that the land of the Holy Land, when you talk about the Holy Land, as defined by the Bible itself, has at least 4 different boundaries when we're talking about the Holy Land. So definitions and boundaries are important. Zionism is the nationalist aspirations of the Jewish people, though. Full stop. Over the time, it really becomes a political entity in about the 1850s. So people say that Zionism started because of the Holocaust. It's not true. About the 1850s, as nationalism is spreading across Europe, the Jews are part of Europe, and they are also becoming nationalistic. Germans are becoming more German, French are becoming more French, on and on. Jews say, we don't have a nation, but we are a people, and we're looking for. So writers of all different flavors are starting to write 1850s, 60s, 70s, and it is fascinating. Important to know, writers like Ahad Aham are also writing about a 2-state solution, though he doesn't call it a solution, but a 2-state experience in the 1890s. So this is not a new experience. So that is critical to understand what Zionism is. Zionism has been tainted in the same way as being a card-carrying member of the ACLU, right? How that was a bad thing for a while, right? So I'm proud to say that I'm a Zionist, but not as defined in popular parlance of sending an army to displace people. That's not what Zionism is at all. Just as the Palestinians have national aspirations, Zionism is the Jewish national aspirations.
Mm-hmm. So we have a couple of other things here, but we're kind of interested, and I'm sure they're going to come up. We wanted to spend the majority of this time maybe including you into this conversation, and so what are your initial thoughts as you kind of hear where Greg and I are going, and then we'll kind of bring in some of the other pieces that we've talked about as we go.
And I also want to say, as often as we talk about Israel-Palestine, we also move into theology. We move into so many different areas. It is amazing.
So this would be a question for Rabbi Harris.
Is that microphone on? Is the light? It should be a green light if you just tap on it. Okay, it should be green.
I can just stand up
No, it's just because it's being recorded. It needs to be on. Try it out. No. We're recording this thing. Okay. If we got another microphone, that'd be good.
Oh, is that better now?
Perfect.
Okay, so that's good. Okay, so my question's for Rabbi Harris. Our church is involved in doing good works in the Holy Land in the sense of humanitarian support for causes there. Like, for example, we give support to a hospital. We do collections for Palestinian school kids, that type of thing. One thing we never look at is humanitarian support for the need in Israel. Can you comment on humanitarian needs in Israel with respect to medical care or poverty or people traumatized by terrorism or other needs, and how would people help support that?
Absolutely, and thank you for that question. It is so important to recognize the trauma that is happening on both sides, and not to see. I think this was just a reflection on the ambassador, who is such a insightful person into the region. I was surprised that type of question in his 30-minute presentation, it didn't feel like there was recognition of trauma on both sides. So bus bombings, missiles, all of those things that are occurring within Israel, there's a lot of PTSD on both sides. And recognizing that this is not just two sides, but it brings in so many other factors that maybe we'll go into in a little bit later. There is poverty in Israel. Israel is a full country with all of its problems. So the teachers go on strike, the garbage needs to be picked up, all of those things that happen. When we go, and maybe we'll do a trip together, I love to bring the congregation where we do gleaning. We pick from the land. The food goes to a food bank, and it's a direct service, if you will. When I was there in December, we were in the north, in the Golan, and there was an organic farm who hires students and teenagers who are going to fall between the cracks. They're not going to succeed in society. They're not going to go through either. In Israel, it's mandatory either for military service or national service. Not everyone has to go into the military. There could be national service, teaching in schools, things like that. Think of Teach for America, sort of. Being able to support people. So there is poverty. I can direct you to specific programs if you want. There is drug addiction. There is spousal abuse. There are all those things, all that are just indicators, as well as schools in Sderot in the south of Israel, where playgrounds are built as bomb shelters because of the few seconds that they have from a mortar or other type of launch that would come from Gaza into these cities in southern Israel. So there's lots of this experience. And I think that it's important to bring that into a conversation.
And if I'm not wrong, Congregation Bethel at one point also helped purchase an ambulance. Am I right about that?
Yeah, we did, right before I got to the congregation. And the ambulance service in Israel serves anyone that is injured. Mm-hmm. It's a fuller conversation about the medical treatment that's offered from Palestinians and others, Syrians who are fleeing the civil war in Syria, that are receiving Israeli medical treatment. It is a completely different story than hits the headlines, but really important to know of what is available. We hear about the problems, and there are countless problems. Those are real. Also, pay attention to the incredible stories of Syrian refugees coming into Israel for medical treatment, and on and on and on.
One of the things, and just to kind of connect that, I don't know if you know, but we recently also participated in purchasing an ambulance for a hospital in Nablus. And so I just kind of think that's interesting.
That's great.
One of the things that we talked about recently is how, and I think I was sharing this with you, is how threatening it feels sometimes when I really get down to it. When we get to the narrative pieces of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and we get to, like, one thing we talked about is how messy the conflict is. And you said it's important to know that, like, if you arrive at a very clean, black and white type of historical narrative, you probably have completely misunderstood the narrative.
Right, we were talking about this at Panera this week.
And I was sharing with you how, like, one of the things about learning like just hearing that it's messy and hearing also that there were, on the Israeli narrative, in 1948, and again, we're kind of still wading through this, but there were different types of narratives and stories and historical data that don't necessarily end up with a very clear and clean narrative for the Palestinians, that I share with you how like threatening that feels to me, because, and I think for many of us, when you have a story that you connect with for your life, and you've built your kind of understanding of history around that story, it is threatening to consider another narrative. Because the feeling is, if I consider that narrative, then it's going to deny and disqualify the narrative I've always known. And I think that that's one of the main issues with Palestinian-Israeli dialogues, is if there, I mean, I don't know how many of them there are out there. Mm-hmm. But is that one of the reasons we don't go into it is either because we think that others are going to think that we've sold out by having conversations with the other side, or because it reaches a point where I can't get you to validate my story, and by you sharing your story, it's going to invalidate mine. That can be a very scary place. And like, one of the things that I've constantly tried to hold myself back from is this, both sides are suffering piece of it, because there always has been for me this sense that one side is holding a bigger stick than the other. One side has more power than the other, and that when we talk, sometimes I'm having to remind myself, okay, this is not about validating, this is about growing. But I do feel sometimes like I like react viscerally to the idea that, well, it's both sides that are suffering, and it's equal. So really, when you look at it,
well, it's not equal. I think that when people try to say that it's equal, they invalidate both sides, right? So the part of our conversation that I think have been so terrific is that we're not trying to find truth, we're trying to expand our truths, right? Meaning that it's not binary, I'm right or you're right. What we're trying to do is, what actually happened is probably in between. And so the simple narrative of 1948, I remember a moment when you're like, well, then Israel went and attacked. And I was like, whoa, because in my story, and we'll say whatever right or wrong is.
We haven't figured that part out yet.
In my story, right, there was a separation, the mandate was ending, and the Arab countries attacked. Mm-hmm. And then Israel responded. They happened to have won. Right? But so we're looking to, and within that, that's not the end of the story. So within that, it's a war situation, and bad things went on, and Palestinians left because they were encouraged to leave by the Arab countries, and Israeli soldiers also pushed them out. All of those things are true, because war is bad, and all of those things happen within it. But it doesn't invalidate an expanded sense of all of these things can be true, and Palestinians deserve a homeland, and the Jewish people deserve a homeland. So I agree with you that sometimes when we're in these conversations, and people should also know that we've been getting pushback from other people about having our dialogues with each other. That for you being in such close conversation, how could you do that? You're normalizing the da-da-da-da. And for me, because your name is not a neutral name. Your father who has spoken here is a leader with a clear viewpoint and is well published. Now, it hasn't, you are not your father. You are your own beautiful person. But to recognize that each of us have received pushback for even this mild conversation that we have, I think it's important to recognize. If we can't do it here, though, there is no way.
Well, that's what I was saying. I was like, if we can't solve this between us, it's What else? What other thoughts do you guys have, Charles?
You can't even agree on a dialogue. That kind of worries me, like what the correct dialogue, as far as getting a peace. But if you could just put it in, what are the concrete hurdles that you see on the other side, the one or two main hurdles? Like, Sari, what do you see saying if the Jewish people would do these one or two things, give up more land, this or that, move way past the dialogue and to the concrete part of it, and vice versa?
Sure. And I think it was important to hear from both the Israeli speaker and the Palestinian speaker. There was unanimity that they all think that all of the leadership is bad. Right, that they're all dated, both on the Palestinian side and on the Israeli side.
Yeah, I think one of the things, Charles, that I remember Greg saying up front that really struck home for me, and I've heard a lot of people say this in the news, but it was really meaningful when you said it, that if it doesn't include security for Israel, it is a non-starter conversation. And so one of the things I've learned is that Israel needs security. It just does. And it's helpful for me to think about any future conversation that happens. Now, I still wrestle with the idea that I do believe when I see the leadership, again, not the common people, but when I see kind of the way the Israeli government seems to treat Palestinians and settlements, I am still convinced that there is some national desire to take the land. It doesn't feel like the facts on the ground show anything other than that. But I am also very aware that there is, when you just think about human nature and you think about the story of the Jewish people, and especially since the Holocaust, I do understand this never again mentality. I do. I would have the same thing. There has to be a permanent sense of security where there's not even an inch of something stepping in to threaten again the existence of the Jewish people. So I do understand that, and I appreciate knowing that, because for me now, whenever I think about the future, I think about, okay, how can what Israel does, how can it retain, not in any way compromise its sense of security. And I think even the platform that many of the Israeli leaders campaign on has to do very much with security. Unfortunately, I feel that sometimes security can be confused with subjugating another group of people. So if we just push them down so that they never have the chance to cause any harm, then that's the way to achieve security. And I think I would venture to say that Greg and I agree that that's not how you get security, but I would love to hear what you think about that.
No, absolutely. Security is central. That is what Israelis are voting on, what they will do in a couple weeks. They're voting on security. That's why, despite all the different protests that happen within Israel on the economy, it's extremely expensive. People can't find housing, all these types of protests like we had here a couple years ago, they have in Tel Aviv as well. They're voting on security. So there is not that I'm aware of a broad Zionist government desire to take over all the land. There are those voices, but that is not. They've had over 50 years to do that if they wanted to. So if that's actually what the government wanted to do, they could have done that long ago. So that being said, I also agree with you. Settlements are not helpful. They're bad. Settlements are not moving us in the direction. And the reason they're doing it is not because of a grander scheme, but simply because it's a way to throw a bone to the political right within Israel. So it's a parliamentary system, and that gives small parties inordinate amount of power. And the settlements have always been an easy way to placate them and keep them in coalitions. There's been lots of consequences by that, but those have always been long-term consequences and not immediate consequences. So that's just, in brief, kind of my sense of why settlements are happening. The question was, what do I think about can happen on the other side? One is Hamas is a terrorist organization. Hamas does not have, its goals are very, very clear, and Hamas is different than Fatah, which is the Palestinian Authority. They're very different, and Hamas is very clear, it wants to destroy Israel, and it acts in that way. Fatah and the Palestinian Authority, it's unclear, but whatever we can do to strengthen them, to help build civil society, to help build economy in the West Bank, that's what we all need to be doing, right? People talk about BDS and divesting. What I call for and have done from our Bima, our platform in the synagogue, is our pulpit, is that we need to find ways to invest in the West Bank. We need to find ways to lift up civil society, Palestinian civil society, because those are the things that are going to help prepare for a Palestinian state. Right? You can't just throw statehood and say that'll be a failed state. But whatever we can do to help bring an economy, to employ people within Palestine, to build institutions for a free press, which is questionable how free the press is now, to have elections, which haven't taken place in a long time, right? Those are the types of things that the Palestinian speaker was alluding to, and I really wanted to underline, and I thought she was very both eloquent about her take on Hamas, where she was living, and the broader questions as well. So that's how I kind of see the other side as well.
Thank you. Great. What else? Marnie.
It seems like underlying a lot of the issue, at least looking at it from the outside, both amongst people in the United States and people in Israel, Palestine, is a lack of acceptance of the sort of legitimacy of the other groups' claim to a connection to the land, denial on the part of BDSers and other folks like that of the historical connection of the Jewish people to the land of Israel, and of seeing the Israeli project as more of a European colonialist kind of enterprise. And then on the other side, going back to the early days and Golda Meir saying that it was a land without a people for a people without a land, sort of denying the existence of the Palestinians as a people. And I wonder, is my perception that that's still an underlying issue accurate? And if so, how much does it matter, and what can be done?
Well, in some sense, it doesn't matter because Israel is there and the Palestinians are there. One of our kind of questions to be unpacked is actually, historically, it's an open question, when did Palestinians develop a sense of national identity compared to a broader identity? We haven't got to the bottom of that yet, because that's a really interesting question. When did Palestinians want to have a nation is a question that we kind of have on the bookshelf to unpack. So I think that's important to get to what your question is. I can speak only for myself.
Yeah.
Right? That I fully validate and support a Palestinian state.
Yeah.
And a secure Israel as well.
Yeah, I would agree. Marnie, my whole life I've been told a story. I've read some things, like there's a book that Greg and I had gotten at one point. It's called Whose Promised Land by Colin Chapman, and we were trying to figure out, and the nice thing about this book is it uses a lot of primary sources, like it's actually quotes by leaders of the time. It tries to unpack the story. And so, we have that data, And we have those quotes, but it's interesting when you kind of read them, it validates your side if you're looking for it. It validates what you want to hear, what you remember learning, and then how does this feed into my story. But one of the things that, and I'll tell you this key moment, as you were speaking, I remembered, it was in 2002, and I was waking up. I used to set my alarm to the radio. The radio would wake me up. I don't do that anymore. Can you imagine, like, starting your day with like the worst news that's happening in the world?
Yeah.
Like
starting your day with a nightmare.
Yeah, with a nightmare, exactly.
Yeah.
But I remember I woke up one morning, and this was like earth-shattering to me. Having grown up as a Palestinian, I had seen the first Intifada. I was there when the suicide bombings started, and I remember thinking to myself, I can't wait to get out of here, when I was coming to college. And I had formed all these stories in my mind that were very much validated by my experience of living there. And then I woke up this one morning to this Israeli lady being interviewed, and she was saying, I don't know why they're trying to destroy us. She was talking about the Palestinians, and she was like, we're trying to live in peace, and I don't know why they're just after us, and we escaped the Holocaust, and now we're trying to establish this homeland and all this kind of stuff. And I remember listening to her, and what struck me was she didn't sound like initially I was just like, she's lying, she's just like lying to the media. And then as I listened to her, I realized that it sounded like she wasn't lying. She was genuinely feeling a threat by the Palestinians. And I couldn't invalidate that. Like, she feels that the Palestinians are just trying to take the land from the Israelis. And that's the moment for me where I realized there are two stories here. And again, this is many, many years ago. And then from then on, and this is the first time, like, Greg and I were remembering, actually, when we were getting together on Thursday to kind of talk about this, we remembered that, like, we had this moment. What was the moment where I said, like, this is as far as I've ever gotten? What was that moment?
Yeah, so you had shared your story, and I had shared my story, and we each spoke for about an hour, and then I just said, where are we going next? And you said, I've never been this far in a conversation with a Jewish person about Israel. Mm-hmm. And both of us were like, we're in uncharted territory. And let's do it together.
Yeah, and that's exactly it. This was the first time ever I've been able to really open up and lean into this other story. And I have to say, although initially I was just like, it was an epiphany for me years ago, like, wow, there's another side. Hearing the other side has been both eye-opening and, it, like I said, it has been threatening. But I'm committed to, and I see St. John's doing this, I see us committed to an uncomfortable path. Anytime you talk about civil discourse, that's what you're doing. You're basically saying, I'm choosing to like pause on my, like, explosive, like, how can you think that? And just say, what do I have to learn here? Because the conversation has only gone one way. We've seen it. Like, nothing has changed. The situation just keeps getting worse. And so I feel like what we're doing here is investing in a new type of conversation. And it's not, like I said, it's not always comfortable, but we are in uncharted territory, at least for us, for the two of us.
And that's what's important, as the congregation is moving through and just begins the process of discernment next week, is for, in the South you say y'all, but I'm from San Francisco, but how y'all going to be different because of the conversations that you've heard, right? Because if you just if you just keep doing the same thing that you've been doing, then this was all just nice. Mm-hmm. So I thought I would ask you the question that we'll ask each other: how are we different because of our conversation? It felt like a StoryCorps question, right? Yeah. Right?
So to answer this question, there's the nice, warm, fuzzy answer, and then there's the part that keeps me up at night.
Yeah.
The warm, fuzzy answer is I love you, and I love your family, and I love the way that I've been able to approach the Palestinian-Israeli conflict with a much more nuanced kind of like viewpoint. So when I hear someone sharing something, there's a part of me that says, yes, but it's important to understand that as clear as you are on this point, there's someone on the other side that is as clear and has as much conviction around that. And so that's been a beautiful thing. The part that keeps me up at night is, and you know, I shared with you yesterday, I had a dream that you and I were sitting on a couch and there was a person next to us and we were kind of describing to this person. And as weird as this is for two guys to talk about this, but like I had, in the dream, I actually at one point got so exhausted by the conversation that I just leaned into you and just rested, you know, right, leaning into you, you know, and you were just kind of, you had your arm on me. So that's the nice warm fuzzy part. When I woke up from the, from that experience, then I started thinking about today. I started thinking about the uncomfortable piece, which is that there are people suffering on the ground there. And the last thing I want to do is not be involved in direct action, social justice action on behalf of the oppressed, because I am not wanting to offend you as my friend, or because I feel like we're moving the dialogue in a particular direction. Like, I don't know, like, maybe the day will come where you and I have a moment of like, wow, like we now have the same narrative and the same story and we agree on the same path forward. Although justice is always a big thing for the two of us, like we can definitely back that up. But action needs to be done. And so like next week when we come together and we talk about where do we go from here, I don't feel like my desire for immediate response to what I believe to be injustice. And again, it always comes back to who's holding the bigger stick. It's not that there hasn't been violence on the other side. Like I definitely believe that any violent action is terrible and does not move us forward. And I denounce Palestinian violence against Israelis. I denounce bus bombings, I denounce stabbings, I denounce any of that, cars running into people, you know. But for me, there's a difference between a reaction to an abuse of power and someone holding the power and the advantage and imprisoning a group of people, you know, to where they don't feel like there's any other way. And so I do feel like there has to be a point now to where we can say to Israel, like, you can't just keep doing what you're doing. Like, yes, there's a better way, but you have to stop now because you have the bigger stick. And I heard a speaker once from Columbia University, a Palestinian, that I agreed with wholeheartedly. He said that if Palestinians were to, historically, when a group of people renounces violence entirely, then that actually changes the conversation, because then the powerful group doesn't have the thing that they've always, the reason that they say we have a wall, or the reason that they say we have to have troops on the ground is for protection. So if you had one voice that said we're renouncing violence, then that dismantles the reason that the oppressor has. And I remember thinking, like, that's amazing and that's the direction we should go. Palestinians should renounce violence and just make it public and then just see what happens. But it's often unrealistic to ask the smaller person with the smaller stick to be the bigger person, you know, to like be the one to stop. It feels like incumbent upon the more powerful party to be the one to stop. And so when it comes to BDS or putting pressure on a nation, I don't like, I've never really had a 100% position on this. I go back and forth on it, but I do say that I don't think Israel should have a special status as a nation than any other nation that we felt that, you know, economic sanctions to force a different behavior. I have not taken that off the table. But again, this conversation for me, is not meant to hold me back and not act. It's meant to help me act with greater compassion and with a bigger view, not just a pro-Palestinian view, but a pro-justice view for everyone living in the land. And so, sorry, I was kind of lost into that.
I think it's beautiful.
Yeah.
I think it's beautiful.
Yeah.
And that is what I love about you as well, right? So if anything, our conversations should energize us to action, not hold us back. I do think that, so just to be in dialogue, right? I see your dream on the couch as that sense of trust that we have, right? Of leaning into each other. I think it's so important when we talk about justice and security and the big stick and all those things to also look. I was just checking the time.
I was too.
To also put Israel's living in a larger context when we talk about who has sticks and all of that, right? So it's living in a reality. It's not only the Israelis and Palestinians here, right? There are zero Israelis in Gaza, right? So it's important to remember that. Israel has made land concessions. There are 0 Israelis in Gaza. There is a border with Egypt for Gaza. And it's not only Israel that is part of this conversation. It's important to bring in, there's 200,000 rockets in the north pointed to Israel by Hezbollah. So when we're talking about security, Israel's security outlook, the Palestinians are part of that. Hezbollah, Iran, all of those things, Syria, civil war, troop movements that are happening. I mean, it is complex, and Israel is looking at all of these issues simultaneously and how to respond. All of that needs to be taken into account, and there is a fluctuation between what happens in the West Bank and not in Gaza, because there are no Israelis in Gaza, but security is not happening on either side or on any side. But it's really important that this is not two-dimensional, this is three-dimensional chess. And to see the entire region of what is happening here, I think is vital to understanding how Israelis are responding to the world that they are living in. I too denounce violence. I too denounce actions that are happening by Israel to diminish the Palestinian people. We are in complete agreement with that. I spoke from the pulpit not long ago. It's on our website. I gave a full conversation kind of unpacking what BDS is and invite people to look at that. BDS benefits from something that I call the halo effect, of that it sounds like we're doing a nice thing, but hearing what the founders of BDS are talking about is it is a tool for undermining the legitimate state of Israel. So it's not just a mechanism, and I invite people to look at that talk and to think about it. I support direct action, whatever that is. And our conversation should, as you said, allow us to respond more compassionately, with more nuance of what we should do, and to think deeper about how we're going to move all of our people forward.
Thank you, Greg.
So there's the aspect of this conflict that is the most troubling for me, that I'd be interested in your comments on, is the dichotomy between what we consider to be social justice. We see the injustice, we see the suffering, we understand what justice is, each in our own way perhaps. There's that, and then there really is the realpolitik of any kind of solution. And we had the ambassador here, of course, several weeks ago, and he was extremely pessimistic in the way he outlined just how facts on the ground are changing in ways that really rule out a two-state solution. And so my question to you is, how do we reconcile our concepts of social justice and what we believe should be the ideal with the political process that ultimately will involve compromises and have to sort of seem unjust in some sense? Thank you.
Yeah, I was surprised by like I said, I didn't see all the ambassador's presentation, but I was surprised by his pessimism and his presentation of settlements. I turned people to David Makovsky at the Washington Institute, actually in this past year has come out with a map of where settlements are, that the majority of what's termed settlements, which is anything over the Green Line, the 67 Green Line, most of them are natural growth suburbs of Jerusalem, the largest number. They're not these outposts, though there are. When we think of settlements and settlers, we're thinking of these like outposts. And this is the crazy part, most of what the final agreement will be has been sketched out long ago by people a lot smarter than us, with a lot more knowledge than us. It's already pretty much been sketched out. And even if Israel keeps building settlements here or there, they're going to have to withdraw, and they've shown that they will do that. And if anything, it was Prime Minister Sharon, who was as right-wing as you could get. He really was the father of building the settlement structure, was the one that pulled out. So I am pessimistic based on the politicians, not on its ability to be done. I don't think that either the Jewish Israelis, the Palestinians, the Arab countries around it, because they need to be bought into this, are preparing any of our people for peace. That's what I'm pessimistic about, because without that, it's not going to move forward. I think the solution has already been sketched out long ago and been validated and revalidated, right? There will be very hard things. And we've said this. Palestinians are not going to be returning to Haifa, right? Even if that's where their people are from. There will have to be some monetary compensation for that. Like, in the end, all those things have been sketched out. That's not radical, but that's painful to internalize for all of the people. Israelis will have to have Jerusalem, some aspect of Jerusalem, something called Jerusalem, will be the capital of a Palestinian state. That's clear. Now, where the lines are drawn, how it's done, all those things, I'm sure those maps have been drawn. But something called Jerusalem will be the capital of Palestine, because there's no other way to get through it. It doesn't mean that particular street is going to be, but that is central to it as well. And that's what I mean by really hard, but all of our people are not prepared for that.
Yeah, thank you, Greg. And I would just add, like, there's been the intifadas, as you're aware, which in Arabic mean uprising. The whole idea behind an intifada is to change the status quo. It's to say things aren't working the way they are. We had a first one in 1987, which I remember very well. And that was primarily nonviolent. It was, there was violence, but it's primarily nonviolent. Then the one that happened in 2001 took on a completely different strategy. But the thing that I would say is that with both those intifadas, the realities didn't really change. Like, we didn't move closer to peace. We thought we did after the first intifada, but the second one did not bring us any closer. But I still really believe that there has to be a disruption of the status quo in order for us to move forward, in order for Israel and the Palestinians to say, yes, we are going to actively move toward peace negotiations. And what I don't know is what is the thing that's going to change the status quo. So BDS, one of the things that BDS promises, and again, we don't know how effective it will be, or if it's the right strategy or not. But it promises a changing of the status quo, right? Puts pressure on Israel, and then it kind of forces, from an economic standpoint, pushing toward a different type of solution. But if it's not BDS, it has to be something else. But what I feel pessimistic about is if we stay on the trajectory we're on now, with the status quo, nothing's going to change. And so a creative thinking and thinkers are going to have to figure out a way to shift the status quo so that you're in a different position, so that you have to either force the conversation or it happens organically.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment again. You know, I feel very strongly that BDS is not.
I know you do.
You know, is not, because it's not putting leverage in the right places. So what, you know, it's important to think about where are the leverage points of this, right? So BDS is not putting leverage on Hamas, right? And where its goals are stated very clearly, it's not putting leverage on Saudi Arabia, right? Or the Arab countries, right, who need to greenlight any movement for the Palestinians. Right? They need to be behind any of this. It's not greenlighting support from Egypt because the Muslim Brotherhood are aligned with Hamas, right? That this is, Israel wants peace. Let me be very, very clear about this. And it wants a sustained partner in peace. That means that they need to have a real deep partner able to both control its population, meaning to bring people around to whatever is decided by the Palestinian Authority, right? Need to be able to back that, and there hasn't been that. So Israel has made land concessions, right? It withdrew from Gaza.
We're starting a whole nother topic.
Right, but I think that it's important to recognize, right, that it has, and it is prepared to continue to do that. But I just don't see BDS as putting leverage in the right places, and so it's not a complete answer.
We're right on time, and I did want to just offer one last thing. Greg and I on. I really want to thank you for being here. This is great. I wanted to conclude. One of the things that Greg and I were talking about this last week, and it was a real moment, a home moment for me, is that both the Israeli people and the Palestinian people can understand longing for home. Like when I understood what Zionism was historically, it's this longing for home, and I think about Palestinian refugees, and I think about Palestinians today, and I think about Israelis today living in Israel and the occupied territories. It's really just about longing for home. And I do feel like if we can, the more we lean into what it feels like to really long for a homeland and to long for a place that you can call home, that is exactly what home is, to be able to take your shoes off at the end of the day and just rest with a friend. That's at the end of the day, we can all understand what that feels like, and maybe starting with what that feels like, we can, work backwards from that and get there at some point. But that is a beautiful commonality that we can all touch on. So thank you, and Anne, whatever you want to say.
Thank you, and I too would like to thank Rabbi Greg, but also Sari for doing something remarkable today, and that is they gave us an example of how you can tackle a sensitive and complex and difficult subject as people of faith through civil dialogue. And that's what we're aiming at. And of course, we learn from that, and that's the basis for action. So thank you so much, both of you, for doing that for us today. Thank you. And we'll see you all next week. Next week, our own John Ross is going to lead us in a discussion of discernment about what we can do as a faith community going forward to help on this subject. Thank you so much.